To many, the Canada goose is a fascinating and beautiful bird that signals the change of seasons each fall and spring. To others, the goose is a nuisance, a pest, a potential threat to human health. Yet most people agree that a dramatic increase in the number of geese nesting in suburban landscapes is forcing affected communities to reevaluate their relationship with this adaptive wildlife species.
Here in New York, we're dealing primarily with two populations, what we call our resident goose population, which includes all of our local nesting geese throughout the state. And this is part of a large population that exists virtually throughout the country, extending from southern Canada down through Florida here in the eastern part of the country. We also have a migratory population, or here in the Atlantic Flyway, what we call the Atlantic population. And these are birds that nest in northern Canada and are only present from fall, beginning in late September, through the fall and winter months, and then return back to their breeding grounds in the spring.
The migrant birds in the summertime are all in northern Quebec and pretty much nesting above the boreal forest area and tundra areas of northern Quebec. On the wintering grounds, they both intermingle, and we can't tell one apart from the other. Due to a series of things in the 80s, such as over-harvest of the birds, plus poor production, and the migrant birds from northern Canada, and also a real increase in these resident geese as they became established and started to really increase in numbers. Today we're looking at over 1 million birds in the flyway before we have any hunting on them. And probably 90%, 85 or 90% of those are resident geese, and maybe 10 or 15% are probably the migrant birds. We don't have exact figures on this, but we've seen a complete flip-flop. The resident geese, we estimate, are doubling in number every 5 years now.
One of the reasons for these populations going in different directions is that the migratory population is faced with a much tougher environmental situation in terms of breeding, raising young in a very harsh subarctic climate. These birds tend to mature after 3 or 4, sometimes 5 years before they're able to nest. Resident geese, on the other hand, enjoy a quite comfortable climatic environment, often mature a year or two earlier than the migratory geese, and so they have the benefit of very high reproductive rates. Hunting is an important tool for goose management, and historically we had one basic Canada goose hunting season. It was derived from the desire for sport hunting on migratory geese, but at the same time resident geese were always a part of that harvest, especially in more rural areas. And what we've done is, through several years of banding studies and population monitoring, establish time periods in early fall before migrant geese arrive in late September, and then later in the wintertime when most migrant geese have passed through New York, in our case, when we are really harvesting only resident geese. And resident geese, many of them in suburban areas, are not exposed to the hunting pressure that geese in more rural areas would be, and so they tend to have very high survival rates, often 80 to 90% annual life expectancy. Many geese in our resident populations live 20 or more years. This high survival of resident geese is what's contributed to the challenge of managing nuisance goose problems.
A lot of times when the birds are at high numbers in the summer with young and things like this, they're grazing, they're moving into the water, they're defecating, it's running off from the shoreline and directly into the water. There's times of the year when, in the summertime, when we don't have that flushing action, that I think the buildup is significant.
Since 1991, the federal regulations on drinking water put out by the Environmental Protection Agency had changed, and they put new stringent regulations in to govern the drinking water prior to treatment. That's prior to chlorination. And as part of that, it now regulates fecal coliform bacteria before it enters an intake structure for distribution for water supply. As a result of that, all water suppliers, especially non-filtering systems like New York City, were required to not only monitor their water systems, but also to identify any potential problems with fecal coliform bacteria. We were able to establish a relationship between elevated numbers of birds, particularly geese and gulls, during certain times of the year, and elevated fecal coliform bacterial counts we were getting. On average, a Canada goose produces about a pound of fecal matter per day. They're essentially eating and defecating machines when they're out there. Before we were conducting a bird control program here at Kensico, our numbers were in the several thousand range in terms of population on a daily basis out on the reservoir. Now the population is down to essentially zero since we've implemented a bird control program, and at the same time, the fecal coliform bacteria counts have essentially been eliminated during the migratory bird season. The program involves several different techniques of bird hazing tools that we use, one being motorboats, a second we use hovercraft when we can't use the motorboats during icing conditions, and these are the primary tools that we use in combination with the bangers and screamers, which are your typical noisemakers shot from a launching pistol. And from these simple techniques, we've been able to deter the birds from landing and roosting and feeding here at the reservoir.
Although water quality issues are a serious concern, some encounters between humans and geese can produce disastrous results.
Throughout the country, we have programs in place at airports to try to reduce the potential for bird strikes and mammal strikes to aircraft, which is very real and does happen. And Canada geese are one of the animals that do occasionally get struck by a variety of different kinds of aircrafts. And when a bird and a plane collide, a lot of energy is released and a lot of damage can actually occur. There's only about 20% of all bird strikes are ever reported, so it's dramatically underreported, and less than 20% are actually damaging strikes. But we do have some figures that would indicate worldwide the damage associated with bird strikes and mammal strikes is about $1 billion a year to the airline industry. And we do know since about 1912 that over 300 people have lost their lives as a result of bird strikes. And so we try to make the habitat within the airport environment as unattractive to wildlife as possible.
Several man-made landscapes are ideally suited for Canada geese. They can often be found feeding at park grounds, schoolyards, athletic fields, and golf courses.
The types of comments that we get are that I can't walk on the paths. I have goose feces all over the place. We have people that can't sit on the park grass because there's goose feces all over the place. And they're afraid that their kids are going to get sick. They're afraid that, they can't picnic because it's going to get into the food. You have people that they go to concerts down here in Eisenhower Park and they're afraid to sit on the grass. We clean it up very well, but we still have situations where people, look at them and they're very careful where they sit. We know that we have to reduce the population. We're not looking to get rid of all the geese. We're looking to get the geese down to a manageable level. We don't know exactly where we're going. We're trying all the different things to move the geese, to discourage the geese, to discourage people from feeding the geese. It's hard. How can you go out and say to the grandmother that you can't feed the geese? You're going to give them a ticket? I don't think so.
One of the areas that creates a maintenance nightmare for us is the operation of our pools. We have 6-foot-high fences around both pool locations, and they just fly right over the fences. They eat the grass, they use the water, and in the springtime when we start the process of getting the pool ready for the summer season, the staff has to deal with a much larger cleanup than they normally would have if they didn't have the geese population, inhabiting around the pool area.
It's not something you really have to go out there and convince the public that there's a problem, because they see it all the time when they walk or when they're out doing some athletic activity. Right, slipping around and sliding through it, particularly, football teams. I mean, we had a team that played over at Rockland Lake on one of their fields, and, they went out with white uniforms, came back with green ones,
Actually, when it started, it was actually cute. Our members really enjoyed the little goslets going around, everybody, oh, how cute, how nice. They started multiplying. It started with about 3 families, each having about 5 little ones. And all of a sudden you had 6 families and 10 families, and it kept growing. Now, as the little ones grew up, they changed their mind, all our members, because of the poop they basically left all over the golf course.
There's about, I'd say, 60 goslings out here now, plus the adults that are with them. And they're really creating a problem from the dropping situation. And now they're starting to molt, so you're getting in the feathers too. But the droppings are really the worst problem that we have around the ponds and on the greens. And from my perspective, being an old agronomist, why the burning from the droppings on the green really creates a problem.
There is, of course, maintenance time that is taken up with the goose droppings, as far as some of the deterrents that we have used through the years. Would take staff time to go out, set things up. If they were using noisemakers or setting up mylar tape, scarecrows, air horns, that would certainly take them away from their normal daily operation of lawn cutting, scarifying ball fields, the maintenance of the parks as far as the comfort stations. Those normal day-to-day operation would be on hold until we had an opportunity to get out and do some of the deterrent things.
Large lawn areas, especially mowed, fertilized lawns, are very attractive to geese, very inviting. And if it's not absolutely essential that that lawn be maintained at that size or to be cut as frequently as it is, you can make it less attractive to geese. The availability of information and documentation of what's been tried and tested is very limited, unfortunately. Swans in particular, though, we do not recommend because it's in New York an exotic species that in itself cause problems for other wildlife, as well as being aggressive towards people, as well as often not working as desired. So we do not recommend that. There's a repellent on the market today with a trade name of Rejexit. This material probably has the most application to a small property owner, perhaps a homeowner with a very limited lawn area that they want to protect. It's quite expensive, and that's why it's not very practical for large landscapes such as a golf course or a large park setting. Other techniques include such things as fencing around ponds, which is an effective technique during the molting period, which is a month or so in the summer when geese are unable to fly, and so fencing works as it would on any ground animal. There are many ground covers, ivy and pachysandra, that geese do not feed on, but it depends, again, on the use of the lawn. One of the problems in trying to manage habitat to discourage geese, however, is that geese do not always nest in the same areas that they're feeding and perceived as a problem.
Changing habitat is not a good option with Canada geese because they're extremely adaptable and they fit well with urban, suburban settings, agricultural areas, farm ponds, anything that will offer a place with access to water, grazing area. They're very tolerant of this. They're very successful at nesting.
Yeah, when dealing with problems associated with resident geese, it's very important to keep in mind the annual life cycle that the birds are going through. Starting in the wintertime, the geese tend to be least tied to any particular site, but come the spring, often as early as March, geese are going to begin returning to the nesting sites. It's very important to try and prevent them from establishing a nest and doing it as early in March or April when the geese first arrive, not waiting until a nest is established. Once a nest is established, it will be extremely difficult to discourage and displace from that property.
Well, the one thing that really interests me is the adaptability of this population of urban geese and their ability to nest basically right next to people, next to homes, nesting on buildings and structures. Very similar, it reminds me of the white-tailed deer, being able to browse in anything and live in someone's backyard in a small woodlot. Most recently, I've witnessed the Canada goose coming to our bird feeding stations that we set up for programs and for schools, and they're competing with the squirrels and the ground feeding birds for the spilled seed. And they seem not to mind the milo, which even some of the ground feeding birds leave behind.
Some of the areas I found nest once they've gotten really overpopulated in an area are behind the 8-foot fences, also behind enclosed buildings where just the roof is open and the birds just helicopter in, and also underneath people's decks, underneath water cooling towers, just anywhere. There's no water around at all. You'll have them in alleyways and buildings, on railroad tracks.
Recent population trends have stimulated experimentation with new techniques to supplement traditional control methods such as hunting and habitat management. Some landowners are managing resident Canada goose problems with a little help from man's best friend,
Border collies are a new technique, or the last several years has evolved and shown itself a lot of promise for an individual property owner with a problem.
What makes dogs really ideal for managing populations of geese is that geese become quickly habituated to other forms of controls, mechanical controls of various sorts, but the dogs represent their natural predator, and as such they have this natural instinct to flee for safety and respond instantaneously to the presence of dogs. You'll find that initially, if you're coming onto a site that's never had dogs there before, you'll need to spend more time up front introducing the geese to the fact that all of a sudden there are dogs on the property. So you can expect your time investment to be more upfront naturally. And then over time, after the period of behavior modification sets in, the geese really do learn to go someplace else, and you'll find that you'll need to come back less frequently.
When we get into border collies, last year we spent over $25,000 to, run the border collies. Now we're purchasing the collie from what I believe, and I don't know what the costs are on that, but then you're going to associate the costs of feeding the dog and to house the dog, things like that.
Some communities are testing methods for limiting reproduction in suburban goose flocks. Handling geese, their nests, or their eggs, however, requires authorization from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and appropriate state wildlife agencies.
For the past 5 years, we've got permission from the federal and state government to addle the eggs. And one of the things I think people have to understand is that communities just can't go out and deal with Canada geese because they're protected by law. And you need special permits to do that. You need to have professional people involved in the handling of the geese because they are subject to the protections and regulations of law.
The purpose of egg addling is to prevent nesting from being successful, preventing hatching of geese, and at the same time causing the birds to continue incubating the infertile eggs for a long enough period until the nesting season passes, that there'll be no reproduction. The geese will maintain their territories, and then at some point they'll abandon and just join other birds that have not nested.
There are different methods of egg addling. There's freezing, there's shaking the egg, there's also coating it with oil and puncturing the egg. I find puncturing is the fastest method. You're in and out of there pretty quick, and it's the most surefire method. Once you poke a hole through the membrane, the egg isn't going to develop. Shaking it, sometimes you just don't know whether it's going to develop or not. It also has its hazards. Once in a while you will come across a rotten egg and will explode on you because you punctured it. But it is the fastest, and when you do over 1,000 eggs a year, you want to make sure you get every one of them.
Where it's been done in New York, we see the immediate result on the local scale that that particular property that had 2 adult geese and may have had 7 or 8 total geese on a lawn would now just have 2 geese. But where we've done some monitoring of community-wide goose populations where extensive egg addling has occurred, we have not seen the total numbers of geese decline even after a period of 5 years of a very intensive egg addling program. One other technique that's increasingly being used across the country is direct removal and rounding up of geese, and rather than releasing them to the wild somewhere else, having the geese killed and processed often as food for charitable organizations, needy programs such as food banks and food pantries and that sort of thing. Here in New York, we've had one experience with a roundup, as it's called, to remove geese from several problem areas, and I think this is the first technique that has the potential to really reduce the population of geese, not just move problems from one site to another. I would say that when geese are removed from a site, you would expect perhaps as many as half that number to again show up the following year. A removal in a subsequent year would perhaps have that benefit again. And so after several years of removals, I think you could see a fairly dramatic reduction in the number of geese using the property.
Goose roundups can be very effective. Canada geese from a biological standpoint are very controllable simply because they molt during the summer and they're flightless, and so they can be rounded up. Obviously, if you can get around the social aspects of, being an acceptable practice, and so you can round them up, you can reduce adult survival very effectively by taking adults out of the population and, maybe doing this on a 5-year basis or something like that, depending on the numbers you want to remove from a particular group of birds, and very easily control population growth that way.
It wasn't until about 2 years ago in 1995 when Minnesota carried out the first fairly large-scale program of capturing geese from an urban area and having them processed into food using the meat of the birds to distribute to needy people. It was that idea, I think, that helped many managers as well as citizens find the idea of rounding up and removing geese acceptable. The idea of killing birds and simply disposing of them was something we avoided for many, many years and did not favor. And I think the ability to use the birds for a community benefit was something that really made that approach more acceptable to a lot of people. In some parts of New York, there has been very strong resistance among some members of the community to any processing or killing of birds. With that has come reluctance of elected officials, corporate managers to make decisions that they feel might jeopardize their well-being, either personally or for the company involved. I think the level of controversy will vary widely from community to community. I think it will be implemented on a much larger scale nationwide, but it will differ very much across the country and to the degree to which it is used.
We talked about trying to get a handle and reduce the Canada goose population. That brought a storm of protest from the Coalition for the to Save Canada Geese, CASH, which is the coalition to abolish sports hunting, which, you know, you can't hunt in Clarkstown, but they got involved in it as well. And they've put a lot of pressure on the town, local officials, as well as state and federal authorities to back off. It's been a difficult process because every year the pressure has escalated. And these groups are very well tied into the media. You get not only a local media, but a national and international media, particularly when you're talking about taking down a certain number of geese. That brought a storm of controversy in '96, and of course when we did it again this year in '97, even more so. This year, they were cleaned properly, and they went to the village of Walton upstate, where senior citizens are enjoying them right now. I've never had goose meat myself, but if somebody put a burger in front of me, I'd take a bite. I don't think it poses any harm or danger. That meat's been tested 100 ways to Sunday. There's less in the goose meat than in the hot dogs that we eat. I mean, the cost to do the program is basically borne by the local community, which, after all, there has to be a determination and a political determination to do this. And of course, when you walk into this situation, I can tell you from experience, you will be subject to a lot of criticism and a lot of heat, and it comes hot and heavy.
The rounding up and slaughtering of Canada geese is kind of a desperate man's approach to solve a political problem. I think there's no biological principle that has yet been advanced, described in the wildlife biology literature, to suggest that if you remove a certain species from an area that it finds attractive, especially when you're talking about birds, why that would be expected to keep geese out for any useful period of time. Obviously, the geese are attracted to areas because they identify those areas as very attractive for biological reasons. And so obviously the cause of the problem is, in fact, the habitat that we have created. And obviously one obvious solution would be to change all of that habitat. And that clearly is not a practical solution. Obviously you cannot plant trees and change the dimensions of a ball field and still expect to use it as a ball field. But there are different techniques, such as the use of border collies, which have been proven very, very successful in large open areas. Homeowners should be encouraged to change landscaping, especially if their property borders onto some form of body of water that geese are attracted to, should consider and should be encouraged to consider some landscaping modifications along that body of water to make it less useful for geese. People have written at length on these different methods. You cannot solve the problem, the Canada goose controversy, for example, by taking a very, very broad view. There are specific people who have specific problems in specific places, and if you don't address them that way, you're not talking about scientific solutions, you're not talking about biologically sound solutions, and you end up with ineffective solutions, you end up with unethical solutions, and you end up tearing the community apart, and it's completely unnecessary, and that is the view of our organization.
To really deal with managing Canada geese, you have to hit it from a multifaceted approach. You've got to do egg addling, you've got to try to discourage them from certain habitats, and ultimately, if that proves to be unsuccessful, then you can maybe get a permit to round them up. But simply to chase them is not a solution, because if I chase them from one of our parks, they end up in the school playground. If the school playground chases them, they end up back in the park again or in the pool.
How many geese should there be here? I think it comes down to a carrying capacity question, but we really have to define carrying capacity not in the fact of the number of habitat that's available for the number of geese that are out there, but the people's carrying capacity and how much they allow the geese to be here.
It's very difficult to identify what the right number of geese is for a community. That's a common question that we hear, and I think the important part of the answer is that oftentimes the problems reach a critical level far long before the geese are at a biological limit. So there's not a simple answer in terms of the number of geese per acre that people should manage for.
Well, the future for the nuisance problem, I think, has not hit the ceiling yet, because when we're talking about carrying capacity, there's thousands and thousands of places for these geese still to nest. The carrying capacity is not limited. So for those birds to die because of limited space, that has not happened, and that won't happen, I don't think, ever.
As populations continue to rise with no ultimate solution in sight, communities must continue to rely on an integrative approach to suburban goose management. Cooperation, according to officials, is a key ingredient to the success of these efforts.
Everybody has to give a little bit, because we can not work without the people involved. Obviously, that's a democratic way to do it, and people are very concerned about wildlife. But the people out there that are very, pro-bird lovers and everything else, we have to ask them to say, come work with us, don't stand in the way, let's work it together. And that's where the whole thing has to come to. If we don't work it together, there's always going to be animosities, and I don't think that that's whether it's a person in the community or a civic association or us, or even the people who are in the political power. They're trying to get things done for the people in the communities, and that's where it's at. Work it together.
For more information on managing geese populations in suburban areas, contact the nearest state or federal wildlife agency.